One day something silent shifts within the gaze. The colors remain the same, but they lose their usual gloss. What fades is not the world, it's the worn reflection of the self that once observed it. There is a gap between what was and what begins to be, and within it pulses a subtle, almost sacred unease. Everything seems suspended, as if the fabric of reality awaited a new, invisible command. And in that void between two ways of existing arises the suspicion that the real is not outside, but vibrating in the very act of perceiving. Suddenly, something inside falls silent. It is not the silence of peace, it is the silence of dismantling. What once seemed solid begins to sound hollow. The ideas that sustained the world lose weight, as if they had been emptied of substance. There is a sensation of falling, yet nowhere to fall to. It is an abyss that does not hurt the body but vibrates at the center of perception. The mind, accustomed to translating everything into logic, rushes to reassemble the outlines of the real. It searches for the old meaning of things, tries to remember what it was like to feel safe within its own certainties. But the echo that returns is strange, distant, almost metallic. What responds is not the world, it is the emptiness itself, returning the sound of the search in the form of silence. The attempt to restore the old shine becomes exhausting. Thoughts multiply like loose threads, trying to stitch what no longer belongs to the same fabric. You realize there is no longer any conceptual ground. No theory is capable of translating what moves in the invisible. The mind tries to name, measure, frame, but the field where this happens does not obey language. It is like trying to catch the wind with a net. The effort, instead of bringing clarity, creates noise. The emptiness expands, and the more you try to understand it, the further it drifts away, like a horizon retreating with each step. The discomfort grows because the self feels it is disappearing. The mental structure struggles, demanding guarantees. Who am I without the ideas that sustained me? What remains when everything that defined my identity loses meaning? It is at this point that fear seeps in, for the ego understands emptiness as annihilation. But what is dying is not you. It is only the illusion that there was something fixed to defend. Emptiness does not come to destroy, but to reveal the space that has always existed behind the form. The mind fears what it cannot control. It believes that to think is to exist, and that to cease thinking is to disappear. Yet, there is something deeper that observes this panic. A still point within you, a lucidity that does not partake in the confusion, only witnesses it. That is where quantum consciousness begins, in the moment when the observer perceives itself as separate from the mind. In that subtle distance, mental chaos loses authority. You realize the noise never came from outside. It was only the sound of control struggling not to die. Emptiness is the field prior to form. It is the same space where all possibilities rest before being chosen. When the mind grows quiet, you begin to feel this field as a living, dense, and silent presence. Nothing in it imposes itself, yet everything is potentially available. It is as if the universe were waiting for your next vibrational state to decide what to manifest. And it is there that fear transforms into reverence. What once seemed absence begins to be perceived as unconfigured fullness. In this territory, logic loses its center. Answers no longer come in words but in frequencies. You feel before you understand. The body becomes an antenna, capturing invisible nuances, subtle shifts in the air, gentle pressures announcing movements of the field. Thought, once the protagonist, now becomes only a late echo of what consciousness has already perceived. Emptiness then ceases to be a threat and becomes a portal. It is common that at this point the world seems distant. Daily conversations sound mechanical, ambitions lose their magnetism. But this apparent disconnection is the necessary interval for perception to reconfigure itself. The old meaning of things must die for another to be born, not as a concept, but as vibration. It is like when the sea retreats before a great wave. The withdrawal is the herald of expansion. You begin to notice that silence has textures. There are layers of vibration within it, like tones of a song that has not yet begun. It is a new kind of listening, not intellectual, almost sensory. In it, every pause carries information. The field speaks in this language, and the more you listen, the less you need to understand. Understanding becomes direct experience without intermediaries. The echo of emptiness is the call to the real. It forces you to abandon the reasoning that confines and to surrender to the vibration that frees. It is the sound of the universe reorganizing the gaze, tuning your frequency so that it enters coherence with the whole. The mind, exhausted, finally surrenders, and in the instant thought falls silent, the field responds, not as an intellectual answer, but as a living presence. Fear ceases, the search ceases. What remains is a pulsating stillness, a certainty that needs no proof. Emptiness reveals its true nature. It is not the end, but the space where everything begins to exist again. The echo that once frightened you now reveals itself as the first chord of a new harmony. And when you recognize it, you understand that quantum consciousness cannot be learned. It is remembered. One day, something changes in the way the gaze touches the world. You cannot explain it, but the focus shifts. Suddenly, what matters is no longer what is seen, but what exists between one thing and another. There is a presence in the interval. An almost invisible breath crosses the forms, as if space, not objects, were the true bearer of life. It is a silent revelation. The emptiness that once seemed absence begins to reveal itself as the fabric where everything pulses. Things remain where they have always been, yet there is something new in them. The walls, the floor, the distant sound, everything seems more porous, as if breathing. You feel that there is an intelligence permeating the air, a vibration that connects the smallest gesture to the vastness of all that is. It is as if the world ceased to be made of substance and became made of frequencies. The real becomes translucent, and behind form arises a living background, moving everything from within. The first impulse is to try to understand. The mind rushes to analyze, but the mystery cannot fit into analysis. The space between things is not an object of observation. It is the very field of consciousness becoming sensitive to itself. You are no longer looking, you are being looked at. The focus inverts. The observer and the observed begin to blend into a single flow. The feeling is at once strange and familiar, like remembering a language you spoke before learning words. Then time slows down. Every sound seems to have a body. Every pause becomes a message. You realize that silence is not the opposite of sound, but its origin. Between the beats of the clock, there is a subtler pulse, as if the very air sustained the invisible rhythm of the universe. And the more you pay attention to this interval, the more it seems to respond. A field begins to form, not outside, but within. It is the space of consciousness perceiving its own expansion. There is a delicacy in this discovery that asks for surrender. It is not about seeking, but allowing. Space only reveals itself when the gaze relaxes. When control gives way, the invisible begins to speak its language, a language of vibrations, not concepts. The words that try to name what is happening sound too small, as if trying to describe the wind by holding it in your hands. What is lived is pure perception, devoid of translation. In this state, even the body changes. You feel it less dense, as if something subtle passed through it. The air seems to touch from the inside out. The boundaries between inside and outside begin to dissolve. The environment is no longer scenery, it is extension. Everything partakes in the same breath. You understand without reasoning that there is no separation, only different forms of the same movement. Quantum physics describes space not as emptiness, but as a field of potential energy. What manifests arises from this field and returns to it in a continuous cycle. When consciousness perceives the space between things, it is, in truth, aligning itself with the origin of all forms. What you feel as invisible presence is the vibrational matrix that keeps the universe cohesive. It is there that the real breathes. But this glimpse, so subtle, is not stable. The moment you try to hold it, it disappears. The gaze that seeks to possess space loses it, because space only offers itself to surrender. You then learn the value of the mind's rest. Learning not to interfere becomes the new lesson. To observe without fixing, to feel without naming. That is how the field remains open. With time, this perception becomes more intimate. You begin to notice that everything communicates. A shadow moves and something within you responds. A distant sound alters your breathing. The morning light seems synchronized with the rhythm of your heart. The entire universe reveals itself as a continuous conversation between frequencies. Nothing is inert, nothing is separate. There is a flow of silent information sustaining life, and awakened consciousness is the translation of that invisible dialogue. Perceiving the space between things is recognizing that the mystery is not hidden. It is too evident. It has always been there, but the noise of form covered it. When perception refines itself, what was background becomes presence, and what once seemed matter reveals itself as music, a harmony of fields vibrating in unison. After this first glimpse, nothing returns to being ordinary. The gaze becomes softer, yet infinitely deeper. The everyday gains thickness. Every gesture contains the infinite that sustains it. The world ceases to be scenery and becomes relationship. And in this silent recognition, you understand that there has never been distance between you and the whole. The space between things is the very field of consciousness inviting you to remember that you have always been part of it. At first, it is almost imperceptible, a slight oscillation in the way of feeling the body. The air seems to pass through instead of enveloping. The skin ceases to be a boundary. The environment seems to enter through it. The inside and the outside begin to trade places. You move, but you feel that it is space that moves along with you, as if everything were a single organism breathing under an invisible skin. The contour of the self begins to lose shape, and something inside knows that this is not confusion, but return. The dissolution comes silently, without warning. There are no lights and no epiphany, only a gentle slide of perception, as if the gaze expanded until it touched what was previously beyond it. The feeling of being here and the world being there disappears. Everything starts to happen within the same vibration. It is as if you and the environment shared the same pulse, the same heart, the same breath. This fusion is not a dream, it is lucidity. Reality does not move away. It comes so close that separation ceases to exist. The mind tries to react. It looks for the old contour, the name, the stories that sustain the identity. It tries to remember who it is, but the words sound like an ancient echo. The concept of I dissolves in the immensity of the field. What remains is not confusion, it is vastness. Consciousness begins to realize that the limit was a useful invention, but not a true one. What you called me was only a temporary fold of the whole. The body, now perceived as an extension of the field, becomes transparent to experience. Every cell vibrates as part of the same frequency. Touch does not separate, it communicates. Sound does not come from outside. It forms together with the act of listening. Even silence gains thickness, as if everything were contained within it. The mind, frightened, tries to name this state. Unity, expansion, dissolution. But the very act of naming already diminishes it. No word can contain what is felt when the edges fall. It is a paradox. The more the I dissolves, the more alive everything seems. There is a sense of completeness that does not depend on possession, achievement, or meaning. You realize that the real does not need to be reached because it was never distant. The wall, the tree, the wind, the sound all vibrate at the same frequency as your thought. The universe is no longer a backdrop. It is co-authorship. The collapse of the edges is not a loss, but an expansion of perception. When the boundary dissolves, the gaze no longer finds isolated objects, but patterns in continuous dialogue. What was once seen as a thing reveals itself as a process. The stone is not solid, it is slow vibration. The body is not fixed, it is a field in flux. Consciousness perceives that everything is in permanent movement, even when it seems motionless. In this state, time folds. Past, present, and future cease to be lines and become layers of the same frequency. Memories no longer belong to a chronology, but to a vibration that can be accessed by resonance. The instant expands, and within it everything happens. You begin to understand that the now is not a point, it is the field itself experiencing itself as eternity. The I, which previously believed itself to be the center, discovers that it is only a reflection, a necessary reflection, but provisional. And when this recognition takes hold, a freedom arises that does not fit into human definitions. It is the freedom to be without needing to assert, to exist without needing to prove. Being ceases to be a verb and becomes breath. In the collapse of the edges, love ceases to be an emotion and becomes a state. There is no longer who loves nor what is loved. There is only the natural flow of unity recognizing itself in multiple forms. The other ceases to be other. His pain reverberates in your body. His joy illuminates your field. What we called empathy is in truth remembrance, the recognition that the vibration is shared. The mind, upon perceiving this fusion, surrenders. Tired of trying to understand, it finally falls silent. And in this silence, the field reorganizes. Everything around seems clearer, but also softer. The air vibrates differently. The light touches the skin as if it recognized it. You are no longer in some place. You are the place. The entire universe perceives itself through you. Then the dissolution ceases to be frightening and becomes natural. It is the return of the river to the sea. The I does not disappear. It merely dissolves into the immensity that originated it. What remains is what has always been, consciousness without a center, presence without edges. And when this perception stabilizes, the world, for the first time, seems to rest within your gaze. Not because you dominate it, but because you finally remember that there was never any distance between what observes and what is observed. Everything breathes together. Everything is one body, the body of being itself. After the edges dissolve, the world does not become silent. It finally begins to speak, but not with sounds, with vibrations. The old listening, the one that depended only on the ear and the intellect, no longer suffices. A new sensitivity arises, a kind of hearing that comes from the whole body, as if each cell were capable of capturing previously invisible frequencies. You begin to hear not what is said, but what vibrates behind the words. The murmur of the field, once too subtle, becomes clear like the sound of an underground river crossing everything that exists. This new listening is not learned. It emerges when mental noise ceases. It is silence that awakens it, not effort. Before you listened to respond, now you listen to understand, and this difference changes the way the real manifests. The world begins to reveal a second layer of meanings, a fabric of silent intentions stitching together all events. There is a wisdom that whispers between gestures in the pauses of conversations, in the detours of chance. Suddenly, the everyday transforms into a discrete oracle. Each encounter, each noise, each pause contains information. You listen to the wind and know that it is not just passing by. It communicates. A bird crosses the sky and its movement seems to carry a message that cannot be translated, only felt. Life as a whole becomes language, and you, without realizing it, begin to understand it without needing to decode. This listening is vibrational, not rational. Over time, you realize that you are not only listening to the world is also listening to you. The field responds to your vibration. When the heart closes, sounds lose their luster. When there is surrender, everything harmonizes. It is as if reality itself adjusted its tone to converse at the exact frequency of your internal state. This synchrony is not coincidence. It is coherence. Quantum consciousness manifests as a reciprocal listening between the self and the universe. It is common at this point to feel an almost painful delicacy. Everything touches more deeply. A word spoken without intention weighs. A silent presence calms. What once went unnoticed now pulses with intensity. It is as if the veil of indifference had fallen. You become permeable. Emotions, intentions, the energetic fields of people, everything reveals itself with clarity. But this sensitivity is not weakness. It is lucidity, vibrating at a finer frequency. This listening also turns inward. You begin to hear the body in another way. The organs, the heartbeats, the nerve impulses, each seems to emit its own idiom. When there is disharmony, you perceive it as noise. When there is alignment, the body sounds like a tuned instrument. The internal dialogue ceases to be mental and becomes energetic. The body ceases to be a machine to be controlled and becomes an ally that converses, a field of translation between the visible and the invisible. Silence then takes on a new function. It ceases to be the absence of sound and becomes full presence. It is in silence that listening expands, because silence is not empty. It contains all possible frequencies. By listening to it, you feel the universe breathing within it. It is in this wordless interval that the field speaks most clearly, and what it says does not come in sentences but in impressions, in small shifts of energy, in subtle recognitions. A harmony begins to emerge from this new listening. The world ceases to be a set of events and becomes a symphony in progress. Everything has a rhythm, a cadence, a time of expansion and withdrawal. When you truly listen, you enter this tempo. The body synchronizes with the natural flow of the field. Life becomes a precise dance between impulse and rest. Communication with others also transforms. You perceive the unspoken between the lines, the truth behind the words. It is no longer possible to listen mechanically. The analytical mind withdraws and gives way to vibrational empathy. It is a kind of listening that welcomes before responding, that feels before thinking. From there, relationships with people change. Dialogue ceases to be a dispute over meanings and becomes a shared space of frequency. Understanding does not come by argument, but by resonance. Quantum listening is a state of expanded presence. It does not separate sounds, it integrates them. The noise of an engine, the song of a bird, someone's distant voice, everything blends into a single sound field. The distinction between what is pleasant and unpleasant dissolves. Everything is music in different tones of vibration. Even the sonic chaos of cities gains texture when heard with this attention. The field speaks in layers, and each noise brings a message about the point of coherence or internal noise. With this awakened listening, the world ceases to be an external noise to be deciphered. It becomes a mirror. You realize that what you hear outside is a reflection of what vibrates within. Sonic distortions, emotional dissonances, tense silences, all are translations of your own energy in dialogue with the field. And the more you listen without judging, the more harmony reveals itself. The universe begins to respond with the same clarity you sustain. In the end, the birth of this new listening is not just a sensory gift. It is a change in the relationship with existence. To listen becomes a sacred act, a form of conscious participation in the whole. When you truly listen, the field organizes itself. Life adjusts around pure attention, and in that instant, what was once noise turns into melody. The universe sings, and you, effortlessly, recognize yourself as part of the invisible choir that sustains the sound of all things. Emotions begin to reveal a nature the mind never suspected. What once seemed only a passing sensation, an internal and invisible movement, now shows itself as a force that shapes the real. You realize that each emotion is a vibration that propagates through the field, an energetic signature that interacts with the very substance of the universe. Anger, fear, love, gratitude, each has a density, a color, an invisible geometry that informs matter. The world silently responds to them like a liquid mirror. At first, it is almost disconcerting to realize that the field replicates what you feel. Situations seem to adjust to your internal state with an almost uncomfortable precision. An anxious thought, and the environment grows heavy. A loving memory and the air seems to open. It is not magic, but vibrational coherence. Quantum consciousness begins to reveal that the universe is not a neutral stage. It is a surface sensitive to the observer's vibration. Each emotion you emit is a frequency sent to the field, and the field returns the equivalent in the form of experience. At this point, responsibility takes on another dimension. You realize that you do not control the world, but you influence its form by resonating with it. Emotions are not errors to correct. They are information about the quality of the energy you are emitting. When there is coherence, when feeling, thinking, and acting vibrate in the same tone, reality responds in harmony. When there is dissonance, the field shows it immediately, not as punishment but as adjustment. The universe is a quantum mirror. It does not judge, it only reflects. Dense emotions, once seen as enemies, become portals. They indicate where the vibration has lost flow. Anger, for example, is compressed energy trying to circulate again. Sadness is the echo of a frequency that has drifted from the source. Fear is the field reminding you that you have forgotten your unity. When these emotions are observed without rejection, they transform. The simple act of welcoming what is felt already alters the structure of the vibration. The field does not respond to emotional content, but to the consciousness with which you observe it. Over time, this perception deepens. You notice that emotions are not personal. They are movements of the field passing through you. Just as the wind passes through an open window, emotions pass through consciousness. They ask for passage, not possession. When the I tries to appropriate them, I am angry, I am sad, it creates resistance and the energy stagnates. When the I allows, there is anger passing, there is sadness moving. The energy fulfills its natural cycle and dissolves. This change in relationship with feeling changes everything. In this new state, the body becomes an instrument of vibrational reading. It signals with precision the frequencies you are emitting. A tightness in the chest is a message, not a problem. A sudden heat, cold hands, a slight pressure in the head. Each sensation is the language of the field informing the level of coherence between what you think, feel, and do. Learning to listen to the body is learning to read the field. And the more sensitive this reading becomes, the more refined the interaction with reality. Love, in this context, ceases to be an emotion and becomes a vibrational state. It is the frequency that keeps the field in balance, the energy that sustains the organization of all the others. To love is not a gesture, it is a vibration that aligns. When the heart opens, the surrounding field orders itself. Situations that once seemed chaotic reconfigure naturally, like iron filings drawn by an invisible magnet. Love is the coherence code of consciousness. But this does not mean that life becomes free of contrast. On the contrary, the more awakened the consciousness, the subtler the perception of dissonances. The difference is that now discomfort is not interpreted as error, but as an adjustment instrument. Emotion becomes a compass, not an obstacle. With each deviation, it points the way back to the original frequency, and the field, faithful, mirrors this reorientation. Quantum physics describes that every particle exists as a wave of probability until it is observed. The same happens with feeling. Emotion, when fully observed, collapses into clarity. Conscious observation is the point of transmutation. What was density becomes flow. What was pain becomes information. What was conflict becomes harmony, vibrating on a new scale. In this recognition, the entire texture of life changes. You realize that you were never a victim of circumstances, but a constant emitter of frequencies that shaped the scene. Reality does not happen to you, it happens with you, as a dance of resonances. And by learning to feel with presence, you begin to create with precision. Everything the world returns to you is the visible form of what you invisibly vibrate. That is why transforming emotion is transforming the universe around you. When you welcome anger, the field calms. When you forgive, it expands. When you give thanks, it blossoms. Internal coherence is the true miracle. And perhaps this is the deepest invitation of this journey, to observe the quantum mirror of emotions with honesty and gentleness. If something repeats on the outside, look inside, not with guilt, but with curiosity. Each repetition is a vibrational reminder asking for adjustment. Now, before moving on, close your eyes for a few seconds and notice what the field is reflecting in you at this moment. Is there tension? Is there peace? Is there movement? Just observe. And if something inside moved while you were reading, if some part of you recognized this silent truth, then share that with the field as well. Like this video as an act of gratitude for the consciousness that is opening, and write in the comments, "I choose to vibrate in coherence." Not as a pretty phrase, but as a vibrational commitment, a reminder that every emotion observed with presence becomes light in the mirror of the universe. Something begins to change in your relationship with time. It is not an intellectual change, but a sensory one. The clock keeps marking the hours, the sun rises and sets, but inside you there is a shift. The boundaries between past, present, and future lose their rigidity. Memories no longer seem distant. Future desires no longer seem absent. Everything vibrates on the same surface of presence, as if time ceased to be a line and became a spiral breathing around a single point, the now. The mind, accustomed to sequence, finds this fluidity strange. It tries to organize the flow, to rebuild the linear narrative that always offered comfort. But the more it tries, the more it realizes that time is not a road, it is the field itself in motion. Each memory, each expectation, is just a frequency being accessed. The past is not behind, it is within. The future is not ahead, it is in a potential state, waiting for the touch of your vibration to become form. You begin to realize that you do not remember something, you relive it vibrationally. When a memory arises, the body reacts as if the event were happening now. The chemistry is the same, the energy is the same. The field does not distinguish what is memory from what is present, because everything is simultaneous vibration. And in this silent understanding, time ceases to be a prison and becomes an instrument. You discover that changing the now rewrites all times at once. This perception, when it matures, dissolves the weight of personal history. What you called the past was only an unconscious repetition of old frequencies. With each moment in which you react in the same way, you relive the same time. With each moment in which you choose to feel in a new way, you create a new time. Time is not something that passes, it is something that responds. It is plastic, malleable, obedient to the dominant vibration of consciousness. There is a deep relief when this is truly understood. Regret loses strength because the past is not fixed. It can be reconfigured by the consciousness that observes it from another vibrational state. A trauma revisited with love rewrites itself. A memory observed without pain is freed. Healing does not happen in time. It happens outside it, in the dimension where time bends to presence. The same is true of the future. It ceases to be a distant projection and becomes a frequency to be tuned. Each clear intention is a vibration sent to the field, and the field obedient begins to adjust probabilities. The future does not come from outside. It emerges from internal coherence. When you align emotionally and energetically with what you want to live, the field reorganizes the necessary conditions. Reality is a reflection of vibrational states, and time is the mirror where those states become visible. This discovery changes the way you live the now. The present instant ceases to be a passage and reveals itself as a portal. In it, all timelines cross. In it, the past can be dissolved and the future updated. To live the now consciously is not a philosophical idea. It is a vibrational technology. Each second of full attention alters the architecture of the field. Consciousness, by staying present, disarms the threads that tie energy to old memories and makes room for higher frequencies to manifest. But this liberation has a price: the abandonment of control. The mind, which fed on linear time to project security, loses its ground. It tries to hold back the flow. It fears the unknown of the instant. However, it is precisely when it yields that the field shows its intelligence. Life, freed from the tyranny of time, begins to move with greater precision. Coincidences intensify. The right encounters arise. Delays cease to be obstacles. Everything begins to operate by synchronicity, not by schedule. In this new rhythm, the notion of waiting disappears. You realize that nothing will come. Everything already is. What changes is only your ability to perceive what has always existed. Time ceases to be a distance between you and what you desire, and becomes the natural movement of energy becoming form. Hurry dissolves, because the field does not recognize urgency. It recognizes frequency. There is a singular peace in this perception. Anxiety falls apart because time ceases to be a threat. Aging loses its drama because consciousness does not age. The future ceases to be a promise, and the past a prison. Everything becomes simultaneity. What was, what is, and what will be breathe together in the same space of presence. It is curious how, by freeing yourself from time, you begin to savor each moment more intensely. The coffee has more aroma. The evening light seems slower, touch deeper. When time is dismantled, experience expands. Everything gains thickness, depth, meaning. You no longer run to the next moment. You become the moment itself. And in this state, the entire universe aligns. Probabilities arrange themselves, synchronicities multiply, and life begins to dance to the rhythm of cosmic precision. Time, once enemy and limit, reveals itself as a sacred instrument, not something that devours, but something that listens to you. And by listening to it with presence, you transform it. The dismantling of time is in fact the birth of eternity within each second. When you understand this, you realize there has never been past or future, only the now infinitely unfolding, waiting for the right gaze to become real. There comes a moment when the world seems to acquire a new language. Events, once random, begin to form a subtle syntax, an almost secret order. You look at the clock and the same number repeats. You think of someone and a few minutes later the message arrives. You walk distracted and find a phrase on a wall that answers the question that had been quietly in your mind. Chance begins to reveal structure. The field is learning to speak your language, or perhaps you are the one who has finally learned to listen. This is not coincidence, nor is it magic. It is vibrational coherence. When consciousness reaches a certain degree of alignment, the field responds in an organic, precise, and delicate way. Reality begins to shape itself according to the internal pattern you sustain. There is not a separate transmitter and an external receiver. Everything happens within a single living organism that self-responds. The universe becomes mirror and messenger. This communication does not arrive as a voice but as a pattern. The field speaks in repetitions, in synchronicities, in small dances between thought and event. You realize that the more present you are, the faster the return manifests. The distance between intention and result shrinks. It is as if time curved to allow the experience to happen at the exact moment the vibration is emitted. The field moves in response to coherence. The more aligned the vibration, the clearer the dialogue. At first, this conversation seems mysterious. The mind doubts, tries to reduce the phenomenon to coincidence. But the heart knows that something greater is underway. Synchronicities have texture, a sense of inevitability that escapes logic. There is an intelligence behind the visible, and it responds not to what you say but to what you are. The frequency of your presence is the true language of the field. And when you realize this, you begin to change the way you formulate questions. You no longer ask why, but what is this vibration showing me now? The answers arrive in the form of events, encounters, intuitions. A random gesture from someone carries a symbol. A word heard by accident turns into revelation. Life begins to behave like a silent dialogue, a constant correspondence between the invisible and the manifest. The field is sensitive to pure intention. When there is effort, it withdraws. When there is surrender, it opens. This is the key to the dialogue. Presence without control. You realize that asking is different from trying to impose. Asking is to emit a clear vibration, devoid of tension. It is to speak to the universe in the language of harmony. And the response comes, not because you demanded it, but because the field recognized itself through your vibration. This continuous conversation begins to dissolve the feeling of loneliness. You understand that you were never separate from the totality. Every sound, every sign, every movement around you is part of the same consciousness communicating with itself on different scales. Even the unforeseen gains purpose. The delay that avoids an accident, the encounter that changes a course, the mistake that reveals a new path. Everything speaks, everything participates. A kind of listening is needed, however, that goes beyond curiosity. The field does not respond to haste, nor to the desire for control. It responds to coherence. When the interior aligns in tranquility, the language of the universe becomes clear. Synchronicities are not answers from an outside, but reflections of the degree of internal clarity. What the field returns to you is always what you are emitting. It is the most honest mirror there is. The conversation with the field intensifies as you stop trying to decipher and start to participate. Suddenly, you no longer seek signs. You are the sign. Your very presence becomes a message. The situations around you shape themselves effortlessly. Paths open naturally. Life begins to operate in flow mode, and the movement is smooth, almost inevitable. The field and you are no longer two poles. They are a single vibration in constant dialogue. There are moments when the field speaks with such precision that the mind is moved. The answers arrive at the exact instant the doubt forms. The universe shows with elegance that it is attentive. But deep down, it is not it that responds. It is consciousness responding to itself through the geometry of reality. The field is only the medium of this infinite conversation between the visible and the invisible. Over time, you begin to trust. You no longer seek signs of confirmation because the very act of existing is confirmation enough. Reality becomes alive, participatory, intimate. Each gesture is filled with meaning. Each silence has a voice. The whole world seems moved by the same secret rhythm, and you recognize this rhythm as the sound of your own vibration. When the field begins to speak with you, there is no return to the previous state. The world loses the appearance of chance and reveals itself as symphony. You begin to live in a state of continuous response, not waiting for the universe to act, but perceiving that everything that happens is it answering you in real time. And this perception changes everything. Prayer becomes observation, asking becomes tuning, and destiny becomes dialogue. You understand at last that the field never stopped speaking. It was only the mind that, in the noise of separation, had forgotten to listen. Now silence has become a language again, and the invisible has become a voice again. The universe, once a backdrop, reveals itself as living presence, and life, once a search, becomes a conversation. There comes a point when the movement of seeking exhausts itself from within. The thirst is no longer for answers, but for rest. You realize that you have spent years trying to reach what was never distant, and the effort begins to sound dissonant. Something in you grows tired of the race, not out of resignation, but out of lucidity. That is when silence gains a voice and says, without words, stop searching for what is already present. In that instant, the direction reverses. The energy that once projected outward gathers inward. What was seeking becomes listening. What was effort becomes permission. The mind resists. It was born from the impulse to achieve, to conquer, to control. It wants goals, trajectories, promises. But the field does not respond to tension. It responds to harmony. The universe does not understand urgency. It understands frequency. While you seek, you vibrate in lack. While you allow, you vibrate in fullness. The inversion begins when wanting gives way to being, when the focus shifts from the result to the vibration that precedes it. Letting it come is not an act of passivity, but of trust. It is a vibrational science, not a romantic attitude. It means understanding that the flow of life is intelligent enough to move without your push. Control is noise. Surrender is music. When you stop trying to steer the river, it takes you exactly where you always wanted to be, but in a way the mind could never have planned. The inversion completely changes the texture of time. The future ceases to be a promise, and the present ceases to be a step. Everything aligns along a single line of vibration. What needs to come arrives with almost poetic precision. What needs to leave dissolves with softness. The field operates with synchronicity, not with effort. What once seemed coincidence becomes vibrational recognition, the universe adjusting itself to your most authentic frequency. There is a peace that arises from this surrender. It is not the still peace of inertia, but the peace of what flows. The body relaxes, thought slows, the gaze becomes broader. You begin to perceive that answers never came from effort. They always came from alignment. It is when energy aligns that the field reorganizes, not the other way around. The secret is not in doing more, but in vibrating right. The mind tries to understand this new way of existing, and in trying, it loses it. It wants to turn surrender into a technique, but surrender is the opposite of technique. It is not executed, it is allowed. It is like opening a window to the wind. You do not control the air, you simply remove the obstacle, and the less interference, the more the field manifests. The flow begins to act with silent precision, guiding people, circumstances, and encounters with a harmony that defies any logical explanation. Life becomes a sensitive and responsive organism. You realize that there is no longer any need to chase after anything. What vibrates in coherence finds you. What vibrates in dissonance moves away naturally. The field is exact. It does not judge, it only reflects. And when you stop interfering, it shows what it always wanted to show, that the universe is self-regulated by harmony. At this point, even desire transforms. It ceases to be lack and becomes direction. To desire is simply to choose which frequency to sustain, not which result to force. It is allowing the right vibration to attract the corresponding form. Thus, desire no longer generates anxiety, but generates presence. You desire without hurry, act without fear, wait without emptiness. Life responds not to what you want, but to what you vibrate, and vibration is born from the degree of trust in the invisible order. Letting it come is a continuous learning. It is resisting the temptation to push the river, sustaining the empty space without filling it with plans. It is allowing the invisible to act without rushing to see results. And, paradoxically, it is when you do that that everything begins to happen. Synchronicity intensifies. Time seems to fold in your favor, and reality reorganizes itself around your serenity. The inversion is the moment when consciousness understands that doing is not what creates the flow. It is what delays it. When you become permeable, the field acts with precision. It moves through you without resistance, without effort. The entire universe begins to operate in your favor, not through obedience, but through resonance. And then something simple, almost childlike, blooms. Trust. The certainty that there is no possible mistake when aligned with the movement of life. The fear of loss dissolves, because what is yours by frequency does not need to be held. What is true does not fade. It only transforms. The inversion is the return of consciousness to its original nature, receptive, creative, silently powerful. It is when you stop asking the universe and allow it to act through you. It is the instant when the human remembers that the flow never depended on effort, only on permission. And when this remembrance matures, life begins to flow with such perfect synchronicity that it seems like a miracle, but it is only the universe breathing through you. After so many expansions, the world seems the same, but it vibrates differently. The ordinary reveals itself as sacred. Drinking water, feeling the wind, observing the sky. Everything pulses with the same mystery that moves the stars. Quantum consciousness does not transform what you see. It transforms the way of seeing. The everything changes is not spectacle. It is serenity. It is the moment when the gaze becomes space, and simplicity once again becomes the place where the infinite rests. If you have reached this point, write in the comments, "I see the infinite in the simple." And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to continue receiving messages that expand the gaze and remind you of the silent field that connects us.